Hey guys, tonight we're going to read a little bit of Five Nights at Freddy's The Silver Eyes before I go to bed. Mabel's here too, so she may kind of stick her paws in the video. By Scott Cawthon, a Scholastic book, of course. Don't know what that is. Copyright 2022. I thought these books came out earlier than that. Chapter 1. He sees me. Charlie dropped to her hands and knees. She was wedged behind a row of arcade games, cramped in the small space between the consoles and the wall. Tangled electrical cords and useless plugs streamed beneath her. She was cornered. The only way out was past the thing, and she wasn't fast enough to make it. She could see him stalking back and forth, catching flickers of movement through the gaps between the games. There was scarcely enough room to move. But she tried to crawl backward. Her foot caught on a cord. She stopped, contorting herself to carefully dislodge it. She heard the clash of metal on metal, and the furthest console rocked back against the wall. He hit it again, shattering the display, then attacked the next, crashing against them, almost rhythmically, tearing through the machinery, coming closer. I have to get out. I have to. The panicked thought was of no help. There was no way out. Her arm ached, and she wanted to sob aloud. Blood soaked through the tattered bandage. Oh shit, what the fuck did they do to her? And it seemed as though she could feel it draining out of her. The console a few feet away crashed against the wall, and Charlie flinched. He was getting closer. She could hear the grinding of gears and the clicking of servos, ever louder. Eyes closed, she could still see the way he looked at her. See the matted fur and the exposed metal beneath the synthetic flesh. Suddenly, the console in front of her was wrenched away. It toppled over, thrown down like a toy. The power cords beneath her hands and knees were yanked away, and Charlie slipped, almost falling. She caught herself and looked up just in time to see the downward swing of a hook. Damn! Welcome to Hurricane, Utah. Charlie smiled wryly at the sign and kept driving. The world didn't look any different from one side of the sign to the other, but she felt a nervous anticipation as she passed it. She didn't recognize anything. Then again, she hadn't really expected to. Not this far at the edge of town, where it was all highway and empty space. She wondered what the others would look like, who they were now. 10 years ago, they'd been best friends. And then it happened, and everything ended, at least for Charlie. She hadn't seen any of them since she was 7 years old. They had written all the time as kids, especially Marla, who wrote like she talked, fast and incoherent. But as they got older, they had grown apart. The letters had grown fewer and further between, and the conversations leading up to this trip had been perfunctory and full of awkward pauses. Charlie repeated their names as though to reassure herself that she still remembered them. Marla, Jessica, Lamar, Carlton, John, and Michael. Michael Afton, no doubt. Michael was the reason for this trip, after all. It was 10 years since he died. Okay, maybe not Michael Afton then. I think he's supposed to still be alive, I'm not sure. 10 years since it happened. And that's not the bite of 87. And now his parents wanted them all together for the dedication ceremony. They wanted all his old friends there when they announced the scholarship they were creating in his name. Charlie knew it was a good thing to do, but the gathering still felt slightly macabre. She shivered and turned down the air conditioning, even though she knew it was not the cold. As she drove into the town center, Charlie began to recognize things. A few stores and the movie theater, which was now advertising the summer's blockbuster hit. She felt a brief moment of surprise, then smiled at herself. What did you expect, that the whole place would be unchanged? A monument to the moment of your departure, frozen forever in July 1985. Well, that was exactly what she had expected. She looked at her watch. Still a few hours to kill before they all met up. She thought about going to the movie, but she knew what she really wanted to do. Charlie made a left turn and headed out of town. 10 minutes later, she pulled to a stop and got out. The house loomed up before her, its dark outline a wound in the bright blue sky. Charlie leaned back against the car, slightly dizzy. She took a moment to steady herself with deep breaths. She had known it would be here. An illicit look through her aunt's bank books a few years before had told her that the mortgage was paid off and that Aunt Jen was still paying property taxes. It had only been 10 years. There was no reason it should have changed at all. Charlie climbed the steps slowly, taking in the peeling paint. The third stair still had a loose board, and the rose bushes had taken over one side of the porch, their thorns biting hungrily into the wood. The door was locked, but Charlie still had her key. She had never actually used it. As she took it from around her neck and slid it into the lock, she remembered her father putting its chain around her neck, in case you ever need it. Well, she needed it now. The door opened easily, and Charlie looked around. She didn't remember much about the first couple of years here. She'd been only 3 years old, and all the memories had faded together in the blur of a child's grief and loss. Hello, church. Do you have to get in the video too? You're kind of blocking mommy's light. Of grief and loss, of not understanding why her mother had to go away, clinging to her father every moment, not trusting the world around her unless he was there, unless she was holding tightly to him, burying herself in his flannel shirts and the smell of grease and hot metal in him. Oh, this talking about William Afton? I don't know much about Charlie's story. The stairs stretched straight up in front of her, but she did not move directly to them. Instead, she went into the living room, where all the furniture was still in place. She had not really noticed it as a child, but the house was a little too large for the furniture they had. Things were spread out too widely in order to fill the space. The coffee table was too far from the couch to reach. The easy chair too far across the room to carry on a conversation. There was a dark stain in the wooden floorboards near the center of the room. Charlie stepped around it quietly and went to the kitchen, where the cupboards held only a few pots, pans, and dishes. Charlie had never felt a lack of anything as a child, but it seemed now that the unnecessary enormity of the house was a sort of apology. The attempt of a man who had lost so much to give his daughter what he could. He'd always had a way of overdoing whatever he did. The last time she was here, the house had been dark and everything felt wrong. She was carried up the stairs to her bedroom, although she was 7 years old and could have gone quicker on her own 2 feet. But Aunt Jen had stepped on the front porch, picked her up, and carried her, shielding her face as though she were a baby in the glaring sun. In her room, Aunt Jen set Charlie down and closed the bedroom door behind them. She told her to pack her suitcase, and Charlie had cried because all her things could never fit into that small suitcase. "We can come back for the rest later," Aunt Jen said, her impatience leaking through as Charlie hovered indecisively at her dresser, trying to decide which t-shirts to bring along. They had never come back for the rest. Well, crap, they left her toys behind. Charlie mounted the stairs, heading to her old bedroom. The door was partially cracked, and as she opened it, she had a giddy feeling of displacement, as though her younger self might be sitting there among her toys, might look up and ask Charlie, "Who are you?" Charlie went in. Like the rest of the house, her bedroom was untouched. The walls were pale pink, and the ceiling, which sloped dramatically on one side to follow the line of the roof, was painted to match. Her old bed still stood against the wall beneath the large window. The mattress was still intact, though the sheets were gone. The window was cracked slightly open, and rotting lace curtains wavered in the gentle breeze from outside. There was a dark water stain in the paint beneath the window where the weather had gotten in over the years, betraying the house's neglect. Charlie climbed onto the bed and forced the window shut. It obeyed with a screech, and Charlie stepped back and turned her attention to the rest of the room, to her father's creations. Okay. Their first night in the house, Charlie had been afraid to sleep alone. She did not remember the night, but her father had told her about it often enough that the story had taken on the quality of memory. She sat up and wailed until her father came to find her, until he scooped her up and held her and promised her he would make sure she was never alone again. The next morning, he took her to the hand and led her to the garage, where he set to work keeping that promise. The first of his inventions was a purple rabbit, now gray with age from the years sitting in the sunlight. So it's talking about when Charlie saw Bonnie. Her father had named him Theodore. Okay. He was the size of a 3-year-old child, her size at the time. So, plush Bonnie, maybe? And he had plush fur, shining eyes, and a dapper red bow tie. Well, we know where Bonnie came from, at least. He didn't do much, only waved a hand, tilted his head to the side, and said in her father's voice, "I love you, Charlie." But it was enough to give her a night watcher, someone to keep her company when she could not sleep. Right now, Theodore sat in a white wicker chair in the far corner of the room. Charlie waved at him, but, not activated, he did not wave back. After Theodore, the toys got more complex. Some worked, and some did not. Some seemed to have permanent glitches, while others simply did not appeal to Charlie's childish imagination. She knew her father took those back to his workshop and recycled them for parts, though she did not like to watch them be dismantled. But the ones that were kept, those she loved, they were here now, looking at her expectantly. Smiling, Charlie pushed a button beside her bed. It gave way stiffly, but nothing happened. She pushed again, holding it down longer, and this time across the room, and with the weary creak of metal on metal, the unicorn began to move. Stanley. The unicorn, Charlie had named him Stanley for some reason she could no longer remember, was made of metal and had been painted glossy white. He trundled around the room on a circular track, bobbing his head stiffly up and down. The track squealed as Stanley rounded the corner and came to a stop beside the bed. "Hello, Ginger. Do you have to get in the video? Get off the book, at least." You're blocking Mommy's... Ginger, you're blocking Mommy's light. Move your butt, okay? Move your butt. Bobbing his head stiffly up and down. The track squealed as Stanley rounded the corner and came to a stop beside the bed. Charlie knelt beside him on the floor and patted his flank. His glossy paint was... Ginger, quit nudging the phone. Ginger, quit. His glossy paint was chipped and peeling, and his face had given over to rust. His eyes were lively, gazing out of the decay. "You need a new coat of paint, Stanley," Charlie said. The unicorn stared ahead, unresponsive. At the foot of the bed there was a wheel. Made of patched-together metal, it had always reminded her of something she might find on a submarine. Charlie turned it. It stuck for a moment, then gave way, rotating as it always did, and across the room the smallest closet door swung open. Out sailed Ella on her track, a child-sized doll bearing a teacup and saucer in her tiny hands like an offering. Ella's plaid dress was still crisp, and her patent leather shoes still shone. Perhaps the closet had protected her from the damage of the damp. Charlie had had an identical outfit back when she and Ella were the same height. "Hi, Ella," she said softly. As the wheel unwound, Ella retreated to the closet again, the door closing behind her. Charlie followed. The closets had been built to align with the slant of the ceiling, and there were 3 of them. Ella lived in the short one, which was about 3.5 feet tall. Next to it was one a foot or so taller, and a third, closest to the bedroom door, was the same height as the rest of the room. She smiled, remembering. "Why do you have 3 closets?" John had demanded the first time he came over. She looked at him blankly, confused by the question. "'Cause that's how many there are," she said finally. She pointed defensively to the littlest one. "That one's Ella's anyway," she added. John nodded, satisfied. Charlie shook her head and opened the door to the middle closet, or tried to. The knob stopped with a jolt. It was locked. She rattled it a few times, but gave up without much conviction. She stayed crouched low to the floor and glanced up at the tallest closet, her big girl closet that she would someday grow into. "You won't need it until you're bigger," her father would say, but that day never came. The door now hung open slightly, but Charlie didn't disturb it. It had opened for her. It had only given way to time. It hadn't opened for her. It had only given way to time. As she moved to stand, she noticed something shiny, half hidden under the rim of the locked middle door. She leaned forward to pick it up. It looked like a broken-off piece of a circuit board. She smiled slightly. Nuts, bolts, scraps, and parts had turned up all over the place once upon a time. Her father had stray parts in his pockets. He would carry around something he was working on, set it down, and forget where it was, or worse, put something aside for safekeeping, never to be seen again. There was also a strand of her hair clinging to it. She unwound it carefully from the tiny lip of metal it was stuck on. Finally, as though she had been putting it off, and here's Mabel back in the video. "What you doing, silly girl?" Finally, as though she had been putting it off, Charlie crossed the room and picked up Theodore. His back had not faded in the sun like the front of his body, and it was the same rich, dark purple she remembered. She pressed the button at the base of his neck, but he remained lifeless. His fur was threadbare, one ear hanging loose by a single rotting thread, and through the hole she could see the green plastic of his circuit board. Charlie held her breath, listening fearfully for something. The rabbit said with a barely audible, halting noise, and Charlie set him down. Her face hot and her chest pinched tight. She had not really expected to hear her father's voice again. "I love you too." Aw. So, well, they're at least painting William Afton to be a loving father, even though he's a child killer. Charlie looked around the room. When she was a child, it had been her own magical world, and she was possessive of it. Only a few chosen friends were ever even allowed inside. She went to her bed and set Stanley moving on his track again. She left, closing the door behind her before the little unicorn came to a halt. She went out the back door to the driveway and stopped in front of the garage that had been her father's workshop. Half buried in the gravel a few feet away was a piece of metal, and Charlie went to pick it up. It was jointed in the middle, and she held it in her hands, smiling a little as she bent it back and forth. An elbow joint, she thought. I wonder who that was going to belong to. She had stood in this exact spot many times before. She closed her eyes, and the memory overwhelmed her. She was a little girl again, sitting on the floor of her father's workshop, playing with scraps of wood and metal as though they were toy blocks, trying to build a tower with the uneven pieces. The shop was hot, and she was sweaty, grime sticking to her legs as she sat in her shorts and sneakers. She could almost smell the sharp metallic odor of the soldering iron. Her father was nearby, never out of sight, working on Stanley the Unicorn. Stanley's face was still unfinished, one side white and shining friendly, with a gleaming brown eye that seemed almost to see. The other half of the toy's face was all exposed. Circuit boards and metal parts. Charlie's father looked at her and smiled, and she smiled back, beloved. In a darkened corner behind her father, barely visible, hung a jumble of metal limbs, a twisted skeleton with burning silver eyes. Okay. Every once in a while, it gave an uncanny twitch. Charlie tried never to look at it, but as her father worked, as she played with her makeshift toys, her eye was drawn back to it again and again. The limbs, contorted, seemed almost mocking, the thing a ghastly jester. And yet there was something about it that suggested enormous pain. "Daddy?" Charlie said, and her father did not look up from his work. "Daddy?" she said again, more urgently, and this time he turned to her slowly, as though not fully present in the world. "What do you need, sweetie?" She pointed at the metal skeleton. "Does it hurt?" She wanted to ask the question, but when she looked into her father's eyes, she found she could not. She shook her head. "Nothing." He nodded at her with an absent smile and went back to his work. Behind him, the creature gave another awful twitch, and its eyes still burned. Okay, maybe this is an endoskeleton? Charlie shivered and drew herself back to the present. She glanced behind her, feeling exposed. She looked down, and her gaze fixed on something. Three widely spaced grooves in the ground. She knelt, thoughtful, and ran her finger over one of them. The gravel was scattered away, the marks worn heavily into the dirt. A camera tripod of some sort? It was the first unfamiliar thing she'd seen. The door to the workshop was cracked open slightly, inviting, but she felt no desire to go inside. Quickly, she headed back to her car, but she stopped as soon as she settled into the driver's seat. Her keys were gone, having probably fallen out of her pocket somewhere inside the house. She retraced her steps, merely glancing into the living room and kitchen before heading up to her bedroom. The keys were on the wicker chair beside Theodore the rabbit. She picked them up and jangled them for a moment, not quite ready to leave the room behind. She sat down on the bed. Stanley the Unicorn had stopped beside the bed as he always did, and as she sat, she patted him absently on the head. It had grown dark while she was outside, and the room was now cast in shadows. Somehow, without the bright sunlight, the toy's flaws and deterioration were thrown into sharp relief. Theodore's eyes no longer shone, and his thin fur and hanging ear made him look like a sickly vagabond. When she looked down at Stanley, the rust around his eyes made them look like hollow sockets, and his bare teeth, which she had always thought of as a smile, became the awful, knowing grin of a skull. Jeez. Charlie stood up, careful not to touch him, and hurried toward the door, but her foot caught on the wheel beside the bed. She tripped on the tracks and fell sprawling to the floor. There was a whir of spinning metal, and as she raised her head, a small pair of feet appeared under her nose, clad in shining patent leather. She looked up. There above her was Ella, staring down at her, silent and uninvited, her glassy eyes almost appearing to see. The teacup and saucer were held out before her with a military stiffness. Charlie got up cautiously, taking care not to disturb the doll. She left the room, stepping carefully to avoid accidentally activating any other toys. As Charlie went, Ella retreated to her closet, almost matching her pace. Charlie hurried down the stairs, seized by an urgency to get away. In the car, she fumbled the key 3 times before sliding it into place. She backed too fast down the driveway, running recklessly over the grass of the front yard, and sped away. After about a mile, Charlie pulled over onto the shoulder and turned the car off. Staring straight ahead through the windshield, her eyes focused on nothing. She forced herself to breathe slowly, and she reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror so she could see herself. She always expected to see pain, anger, and sorrow written on her face, but they never were. Her cheeks were pink, and her round face looked almost cheerful, like always. Her first weeks living with Aunt Jen, she heard the same things over and over when Aunt Jen would introduce her. What a pretty child. What a happy-looking child she is. Yeah, I get the feeling Charlie ain't happy. Charlie always looked like she was about to smile, her brown eyes wide and sparkling. Her thin mouth ready to curve up, even when she wanted to sob. The incongruity was a mild betrayal. She ran her fingers through her light brown hair as though that would magically fix its slight frizziness and put the mirror back into position. She turned the car back on and searched for a radio station, hoping music might bring her fully back to reality. She flipped from station to station, not really hearing what any of them were playing, and finally settled on an AM broadcast with a host who seemed to be yelling condescendingly at his audience. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the brash and annoying sound was enough to jar her back into the present. The clock in the car was always wrong, so she checked her watch. It was almost time to meet her friends at the diner they had chosen, near the center of town. Charlie pulled back onto the road and drove, letting the sound of the angry talk radio host soothe her mind. When she reached the restaurant, Charlie pulled into the lot and stopped, but did not park. The front of the diner had a long picture window all across it, and she could see right inside. Though she had not seen them for years, it took her only a moment to spot her friends through the glass. Jessica was easiest to pick out from the crowd. She always enclosed pictures with letters. And right now she looked exactly like her last photo. Even seated, she was clearly taller than either of the boys and very thin. Though Charlie could not see her whole outfit, she was wearing a loose white shirt with an embroidered vest, and she had a brimmed hat perched on her glossy, shoulder-length brown hair with an enormous flower threatening to tip it off her head. She was gesturing excitedly about something as she spoke. The 2 boys were sitting next to each other, facing her. Carlton looked like an older version of his red-headed childhood self. He still had a bit of a baby face, but his features had refined, and his hair was carefully tousled and held in place by some alchemical hair product. He was almost pretty for a boy, and he wore a black workout shirt, though she doubted he'd ever worked out a day in his life. He slouched forward on the table, resting his chin in his hands. Beside him, John sat closest to the window. John had been the kind of child who got dirty before he even went outside. There would be paint on his shirt before the teacher handed out all the watercolors, grass stains on his knees before they came near a playground, and dirt under his fingernails just after he washed his hands. Charlie knew it was him because it had to be, but he looked completely different. The grubbiness of childhood had been replaced by something crisp and clean. He was wearing a neatly pressed, light green button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up and the collar open, preventing him from looking too uptight. He was leaning back confidently in the booth, nodding enthusiastically, apparently absorbed in whatever Jessica was saying. The only concession to his former self was his hair, sticking up all over his head, and he had a 5 o'clock shadow, a smug adult version of the dirt he was always covered in as a kid. Okay. Let's see, this video's gone on for about 30 minutes, so next video, we'll start with the next paragraph here. I'm just gonna mark the book, and we'll pick it up later.